Alright, welcome to this very special and impromptu episode where I just top 8'd the Modern Challenge while I was just studying. So even before the first video I was meant to post, the Pro Tour recap series, I guess I'll be talking about my experience with this new build of Affinity, talk about some card choices, talk about how it is shaping in this new format, and hopefully get you all ready for this upcoming RCQ. I'll be mainly talking about also the sideboarding ins and out of the actual matchup I played in the challenge. So that's not all of the metagame, but hopefully an updated sideboard map will be posted soon by me if I don't procrastinate. But if not, I will probably already be posting my sideboard map without the new cards that I used to win the 2025 Axia Now Invitational last year. So hopefully that will give you a broad idea of how the sideboard and the good and bad cards in that matchup. So what and why to play Weapons Affinity in this modern metagame? Like you can see here, Affinity is a proactive, fast beatdown deck that capitalizes token generators and cheap artifacts to pump out a very early Kappa Cannoneer or Krang the Mastermind. Mainly, the main payoff is Kappa Cannoneer here, hence we play all four of them. And the main idea is, in this format, as long as Kappa Cannoneer is played out early, it will just dominate the board. It's hard to race, hard to remove, and it should probably carry you once you get this resolved. That means in terms of the matchup spread in the metagame, it is pretty favored into all of the fair decks of the format. That is Boros Energy, Jeskai Blink, Team of Prowess, or I guess Blue-Red Prowess, Esper Blink, as well as I have grouped Goryo's Vengeance in here as well. The main idea is basically what I just explained for Kappa Cannoneer. Once you play Kappa Cannoneer, once it resolves, you basically win the game. I would say out of the fair matchups, you crush the Solitude decks much harder because they are more interactive, they're a bit slower in terms of pressure, and game one their interaction just doesn't match what you're presenting well. Even Goryo's Vengeance, that's technically a quote-unquote combo deck, because their combo relies so heavily on the graveyard, and we just get to play 3 copies of Tormod's Crypt as a 0-drop to trigger Weapons Manufacturing and Ravenous Robot, as well as having a really high floor and a good Saga target. It just means that they're more likely to have dysfunctional draws and buy us a lot of time to play Kappa Cannoneer and win. Out of the fair matchups, the other side of it, being Boros Energy and the Prowess deck, are still favored, but a little bit more closer, just because they are also very proactive as well, and their threat being 1 mana, 2 mana, just means that if we don't have a fast start with the token generators into a turn 2 or 3 Kappa Cannoneer, and we just try and play out Kappa Cannoneer fair and square by playing out 1-drops, playing out these 0-drops, and improvising it out that way, we may fall too far behind by the time we set up this Kappa. So that's the fair decks. In terms of the yellow highlighted decks, these are quote-unquote unfair decks that we are either able to outrace depending on the context of our hand, or are combo decks that we can actually gear our deck, especially sideboard, towards to flip the matchup. For example, Ruby Storm is a turn 3 or even turn 2 combo deck. Hence, our plan of playing Kappa and beating your opponent down with it over 1 or 2 turns, if not 3 turns, although it is a bit slow, with the combination of like Crypt, potentially shutting their Past in Flames down, Pithing Needle, randomly stopping their RAL, and even like a fast ramped out explosive on 2 to pop and deal with their mana reducers. These are all play patterns that allows us to steal the game. And if you look at the sideboard, we have a lot of counter spells that we can back our threats with, as well as damping spheres and key silver bullet cards that we can either search out with Urza Saga or trying to get towards with Emery drawing into it or milling it. Against Tron is not really a combo deck, it's more of a big mana style deck, and usually against normal big mana style decks, Affinity can outrace it through its fast Kappa starts. Even if it's a slowish Kappa start, a turn 3, turn 4 Kappa is still fast enough to get the job done. However, unlike Eldrazi Ramp, Tron's mana generation is much more sharp and fast. Hence, if they get to their payoff, there is a high chance we lose that way. This is also because their payoff compared to Eldrazi's payoff, for example, like Emrakul that requires the graveyard, for example, Kozilek's Return and Devour that's really strong into the creatures and the board-centric decks. Tron's payoff being cards like All Is Dust that can cleanly deal with our Kappa and some other alternative threats. Counter Great Creator, which is a problem overall. Or even Tron's Ugin getting played on turn 3, which is usually right before we play our Kappa, or even if it's after we play our Kappa. Usually because the Ugin's loyalty is so high, they can tank one hit from Kappa, untap, and try and exile Kappa with the Ugin static and pay for the ward that way. So Tron is probably a matchup where we have to race, as well as have enough sideboard interactions like Consign to Memory and Damping Sphere, and even Harbinger of the Sea. So the bad matchups of the deck are usually like Neobrand and Amulet Titan. These are green-based fast combo decks that require us to play to the board very fast, while they also have disenchants to interact against us. In particular, Neobrand is probably one of the worst matchup of the metagame, even though it's winnable and pretty skill intensive and close. Neobrand 1 has good interaction post board with disenchants, as well as Mystical Dispute that they bring in to fight our counter spells and our blue payoffs. Because of the way their combo is configured, where they want to be consigning their pack trigger, they are pretty incentivized to keep Consign to Memory in. This means that not only does that potentially shut down our turn 1 Saga start that we try and set up to get silver bullet cards like Grafdigger's Cage and Vexing Bauble by turn 3 before they can combo, they can use their Consign to Memory to force through a disenchant on the Kappa Cannoneer and buy them immense amount of turn until they can safely go off. So that's what makes the Neobrand matchup bad. And also, honorable mention is Scepter Chant Control, a main deck Wrath of the Skies control deck that also plays Orim's Chant. So that's obviously a really bad and tough matchup. So that's the overall metagame and how the deck, pans out against. I would say even against the fair Wrath of the Skies deck, the core of the deck does pretty well against fighting through Wrath of the Skies as best as possible. For example, as long as against these fair decks, you can just slam a Kappa Cannoneer right before they Wrath your whole board away. The one Kappa Cannoneer can usually get the job done because it's just so hard to contest. Otherwise, the weapons manufacturing, producing a lot of ammunition tokens, can provide a very, very steep cost to their Wrath of the Skies. Hence, I would view this deck as 1, a Turbo Kappa Cannoneer beatdown deck, and 2, a board control-y deck with a combo finish of weapons manufacturing and engineered explosive. This board control style game plan proved to be very, very strong against decks like Prowess and Boros Energy, and even against like Mirror Match as well, kind of, but mainly against these fair aggressive creature decks, which is why we see multiple Claws of Gix that can, you know, for 1 sacrifice ammunition token and ping something for 2 damage, rather than 0 drops like Mem Knight and Ornithopter that kind of serves as just a chump block. So in terms of, I guess, the new cards, compared to when I won the Axion Now Invitational last year, we got Ravenous Robot, Krang Mastermind, and Skateboard. Skateboard is pretty much an upgrade to Lava Spar Brutes, where the Ward 1 was nice. However, when you are usually going to just equip up your new Saga token and attack immediately, the Ward 1 is less relevant than actually tapping down a potential blocker. So that's one angle of upgrade that we got. It's important to note that this Skateboard can actually also tap your permanents, but more importantly your opponent's lands as well. So there's cool tricks you can do with this. Ravenous Robot kind of reads like a 5th and 6th weapons manufacturing, and you're not wrong in it being a 2 mana token generator that helps you with playing your payoffs quicker. However, the main difference is that weapons manufacturing is really hard to interact with and is really strong into Wrath of the Skies, whereas Ravenous Robot, it being an artifact is nice. However, it being so fragile to all types of interaction, especially creature interaction, is a big downside. And ultimately, it's just a plain simple 1-for-1 against Wrath of the Skies as well. So post board, when you rely on, you know, fighting through your opponent's interaction, your low resources game, Robot is just much less reliable than weapons manufacturing. Hence, I would never play the first copy over the 4th copy of manufacturing. I am playing 2 copies of Robots to try and pump out Krang Mastermind. That could be really clunky otherwise. However, even then, I'm not fully convinced and can see, you know, playing less, playing 0, playing Ravager instead, etc. I will note that the tap ability is not irrelevant. However, it reads much worse than it seems, because I would say the main way to utilize this ability is with Urza Saga tokens. However, if you actually think about the game state that allows you to do this play, 1, your robot has to survive and let you untap. So that means your opponent doesn't have any removal or at that point. And 2, it means that we need to have a Urza Saga ready to be activated with another mana source to activate Robot. This usually means that your opponent doesn't have any removal. We have these 2. So either we're already flooding out and losing by a bunch, or your opponent had nothing and you're winning by a bunch. If you want the haste angle, I would say more often than not, you'd just rather go for like a Skateboard instead. Off of the chapter 3, because it's just a much more, I guess, elegant way of getting this combo, because you're not like expending 2 mana and a card from your hand, you're just searching it out through the 3rd chapter. In terms of the sideboard, because we're a blue deck, we're able to play the best counter spells of the format. Keynote is Metallic Rebuke, which fits our deck really nicely, and one of the best ways to fight cards like Clarion Conqueror, Wrath of the Skies, and hard-hitting permanents and answers against our deck post board. Mystical Dispute is here because we are pretty weak against opposing Mystical Dispute, where our payoff are all blue. So, you know, trading 1 mana with our setup payoff is pretty backbreaking, especially if our whole game plan revolves around this. So this dispute is usually a way to fight against your opponent's dispute. There are also matchups where you get to board this in because they're either a combo deck. So yeah, upside there. Consigned to Memory is, you know, as many of you may know, one of the most hard-hitting, strongest answers against colorless strategies. I would also say it's one of the most overboarded card in the Affinity deck as well, just because, you know, you have application against decks like Blink, against decks like I don't know, let's say opposing Urza Saga. So it has a lot of wide application. However, because unlike many blue fair decks, this deck requires a lot of moving pieces to get your quote-unquote payoff down. If you board in Consigned to Memory alongside other non-artifact sideboard card, you're pretty prone to overboarding. Hence, I would only pretty much board it in against colorless decks, Amulet Titan, because you can potentially steal a game by countering the Lotus Field untap trigger, or against Storm, where because you just don't have that many interaction against your opponent's turn 2 cost reducer, having as many of those as possible is pretty good. And outside of those matchups, I probably wouldn't board it in anywhere. With Flare, like I said previously, although Boros and Prowess are good matchups, they're very proactive, and if you stumble once, you can easily lose. Hence, having a Whip Flare to catch back up, especially on the draw, is pretty nice. Harbinger of the Sea. Usually, people play either Harbinger or Blood Moon, and the upside of Blood Moon is its ability to be boarded in against fair decks, especially Solitude style decks, where you can potentially ramp it out with Mox Opal by turn 2 and play it before your opponent can assemble 2 planes to cast Wrath of the Skies. So it's a good anti-Wrath of the Skies card. However, I just thought like those fair matchups you're already favored in anyway, and it's more important to respect the unfair decks that you want to have this alongside counterspells. It's probably the most important card against Amulet Titan, so having a non-artifact enchantment version of Land Hate is really important, I would say, especially because they're so incentivized to bring in as many disenchants already. In terms of the artifact sideboard cards, I'll go with the more obvious ones like Haywire Might. Although we don't have any green sources, with the combination of like Mox Opal and Saga fetching a Mox Opal, it's reliable enough to activate the green ability. And Emery like looping Haywire Might to continuously interact with your opponent's board is also a really important angle when you're fighting against decks like Amulet Titan. Hence, 1 copy in the 75 is very high upside. Vexing Bauble. Although Vexing Bauble is symmetrical, because you are able to sacrifices on demand, there are many play patterns where you play Bauble and basically prevent your Neoform opponent and even the mirror match opponent do what they want. You go to your turn, you activate it to draw a card, play out all your 0 drops, and then buy it back with Emery. This play pattern is incredibly strong, hence I am having 1 in the 75. You also, against Neoform, want to go fetch it with Urza Saga, especially when you're on the play, by playing out the Saga on turn 1 before they could Eldritch Evolution, or if they're like sandbagging their Rider, Hence, I believe 1 is pretty good. Grafdigger's Cage. Against graveyard decks, especially like Goryo's, you already favor and have graveyard hate in the form of Tormod's Crypt anyways. So it seems a bit redundant. However, that overlap against Neoform, where unlike Bauble, where they could potentially just force through their combo with a consign to memory, countering our Vexing trigger, Cage just requires your opponent to kill it with Disenchant. Hence, I like having it alongside Vexing Bauble and alongside Tormod's Crypt. Lastly, the 2 Damping Spheres. Kind of similar to Vexing Bauble, where although we also are a deck that tries to play out multiple spells, multiple 0-drops to play a Cabba Cannoneer, and because Damping Sphere is technically symmetrical, it seems like it will actively hurt our game plan as well. However, because your spells that you're going to be chaining a lot of time are 0-drops, you can basically time it so that you play out the 0-drops and then play Damping Sphere afterwards. As well as that, Damping Sphere preventing your Amulet Titan deck and your Tron opponents from ramping out and killing you before you get to play out your Kappa is pretty nice. And also, Damping Sphere itself being an artifact is really good when you're also trying to develop towards a Kappa Cannoneer as well, because it generates tokens off of these token generators. It itself helps towards the costs, and it being an artifact, hence, you know, you could even just play out Emery turn 1, mill it, and then bring it back immediately. It's just super synergistic with the deck. Hence, even though it is symmetrical, there are many play patterns that allows you to play it for your benefit and for your opponent's detriment. So that's mainly most of the slots. The last slot I want to talk about is Krang Mastermind, because it was probably the most hyped up cards, and its ability to draw 4 cards as well as the body itself being relevant essentially allows you to go up 5 cards in terms of resources. However, actually playing with the card has shown me various sides to it. So baseline, it is a strong card and a unique effect where, because it draws you so many cards and because the body is very relevant, it's very unlikely for it to be air. And yeah, I would say the first copy is very, very good, just because it's one and only. The main comparison people usually made is with Emery, where Emery is also a card that tries to expand your own resources and tries to help you gain card advantage. So the main differences between Emery and Krang is that, one, Emery draws you card, but over the multiple turns that it lives, whereas Krang, even if it's killed, it's already done its thing. The second one is Krang being an artifact and Emery being not, so Krang is technically a bit more synergistic compared to Emery. However, in reality, I would say Emery is slightly better at gaining resources and actually bridging you towards your payoff for your, more importantly, your enablers, because you're able to play out Emery on turn 1. You accumulating card in the early turns to try and get to the token generator helps you in low resources game, helps you when you mulligan, and also helps you post board when you also bring in a lot of interaction. That's something Krang just doesn't do well, because 8 mana is just so heavy, And Krang basically requires you to have already fully set up before you can play it and gain resources. So it's actually really bad post board when your opponent is bringing in cards like Dispute, Wrath of the Skies, and interacting with you a bunch. It's also bad at drawing towards your token generators, because realistically speaking, by the time you've played out Krang, you've already have assembled at least a token generator and some tokens. Otherwise it's just too heavy. So the need to draw into your token generator is just not satisfied with Krang. And also it being a artifact just doesn't come up as much, because if you think about it, if you can cast Krang already, you probably can already cast Cap Cannoneer. What this means is that side by side, very often you can play one after the other in the same turn. And in those gameplay pattern, you'll often play Cap Cannoneer first and then Krang. So the times where Krang helps you to cast Cap Cannoneer is very rare. Look at it this way. If you cast Kappa first and then Krang, you not only get a extra trigger from Kappa, but you also get an extra card of Krang. So, you know, Krang just is a payoff itself, but it's never the ideal way to gain resources. And it doesn't really contribute with the resiliency of the deck overall. So instead of playing one over the other, well, first of all, if you're playing one over the other, I would play Emery over Krang, because it's more important to the floor, raising the floor of the strategy. But overall, like how I said, the first copy is unique and important. Emery and Krang plays very well together. Like Emery potentially milling Krang, Emery drawing towards your weapons to set up your Krang. These are all play patterns that, instead of fighting each other for slot, they should be cooperating with each other. Hence, I have built my 75 like this. Thanks for clicking on the video. Before we continue with it, let me quickly thank my sponsors over at Ultra Pro. This video is brought to you all thanks to Ultra Pro and their Apex Sleeves series. Like the Bob Ross one on my screen, these sleeves are the absolute apex and the pinnacle of the market in terms of sleeves. Their durability, shuffle feel, and gorgeous design are absolutely one and only, so please check them out from the link below. Like Ultra Pro said, you all collect, we protect. Alright, back to the video. In terms of the actual challenge, I went 6-0 in the Swiss into a quick quarterfinals loss against Neoform. And in the Swiss, I mainly played against multiple, like 3 or 4 Jeskai Blink, 1 Gorios, and 1 Prowess. So against the current metagame of, you know, many fair decks, Affinity just shines, and hence I was able to pretty smoothly sail into the top 8. Starting with the Jeskai matchup, because Jeskai's clock is very slow, and because their way of interacting with Kappa Cannoneer is basically non-existent in game 1, besides like main deck Strict Serenade or Solitude plus consigning the trigger. As long as you can get Kappa Cannoneer down early, you can basically always just steal the game with it. So your game plan should always be, how do I play Kappa Cannoneer out safely? And this applies to post board as well, even after your opponent bringing in a lot of Wrath of the Skies and Mystical Dispute. Against Dispute, you want to be sandbagging Kappa Cannoneer until you draw into a counterspell to force through, or you draw into another Kappa Cannoneer to double spell. And against Wrath of the Skies, kind of similar, where you just try and sandbag all your 0 drops until you get a Kappa Cannoneer down and play it out on the same turn. in terms of sideboarding, again, like I mentioned, consign to memory is overrated, so I wouldn't board it in here. Vexing Bauble is also interesting because it completely shuts down Solitude, so it prevents your opponent from Solituding plus consigning on Kappa. However, the more I play the matchup, the more I feel like post board it's less about Solitude and more about Wrath and counter spells, and that's the kind of way they want to play against you anyways. And also with robots and with Emissary, wow, that's a mouthful, and also Krang, your opponent's Solitude is already pre-taxed, so Solitude plus Consign on Kappa is less of an issue in my opinion. So against Jeskai, I just want to be bringing in the counter spells to fight their potential counters or Wrath, and I board out the board controlling aspect of Jeskai. I board out 2 Claw of Gix and 2 Engineered Explosive, 1 Pithing Needle, and that's about it. Out of these 5, and I'm only bringing 4, hence if you really want to be respecting Jeskai, you can have extra card, but out of these 5, I would say try and see how your opponent is playing. If your opponent is pretty aggressive with how they play, in terms of if they always play out like early Ragavan, if they play out Failure, if their plan is really play to the board, you can probably keep in the second Gix and board in these 4. If your opponent is more control-y with like counter spells, leaving mana up, and like removal with cards such as March of the Otherworldly Light, you can probably consider an extra Engineered Explosive to have more of the combo finish potential with Weapons Manufacturing. I would say I don't love Ravenous Robots here because it gets easily traded with the Galvanic Blast effect, like it's Discharge, Bolt, Flage even. However, if you can even get 1 token down, that token can probably trade with Ragavan, so I'll probably keep it in. Against Goryo's, I would say Goryo's you're structurally favored because their clock is slow outside of their frog starts, and their combo is disrupted by our Tormod script. And post board, it's even harder for them to force through a combo with extra graveyard hate and counter spells. Hence, game 1, you probably just try and do your thing, be careful of the combo. And then post board, you first need to see whether they have fully transformed their cyborg plan, which they're a little bit incentivized to, just because if they get their combo disrupted, that's the easiest way to lose with dysfunctional pieces of cardboard stuck in their hand. So there's a cyborg plan where I was also doing when I was playing Goryo's, but it was board out all the combo and board in all the counter spells, including Consign to Memory, to try and set up Solitude plus Consign or Consign or Urza Saga and counter our threats that way. Regardless of how they sideboard though, I usually bring in all the counter spells and the Graph Digger's Cage. Vexing Bauble is alright. And yeah, I would say Shadow Spear is not that important just because rarely you race your opponent. It's more about like burning their life total out to try and capitalize their painful mana base with cards like ping damage with Weapons Manufacturing and Emissary tokens. So it's less about our life total. Needle is actually good to name either their land or frog, because especially if they do the transformational cyborg plan, the frog is a really important piece to really clock us, gain card advantage, and maximize their Riddler, which is more emphasized in that plan. So if they do a transformational cyborg plan, you probably keep it. If they don't, you can consider trimming it. Otherwise, I like trimming Claw of Gix. I like trimming Explosive. And I like trimming Robot. I'm not very impressed with Robot, just because they're pretty incentivized to have like cheap removal as well, like Prismatic Ending. So it's hit or miss in my opinion. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty much the way I sideboard. And then against prowess, I would say usually the prowess matchup is a race. Their clock is very scary, so you want to at least play to the board in some way, either like with Kappa or with weapons manufacturing, pinging down your opponents. You just have to make the board clear and try and close the game quickly before they can like set up a slick shot plus many spells, or even just like burn spell and Corey, etc. This is probably the matchup where Urza Saga plus Shadow Spear can also try like solo the game, just because their removal is all damage based game one with no meltdowns and stuff. So one hit from a big Shadow Spear Saga token is gonna swing the race in your favor. However, important to note, a lot of the prowess list have been incorporating the Storm Chase's Boomerang package, so Saga tokens are less game winning than before, so that's also something to get used to for myself as well. Post board, even though they do bring in Mystical Dispute, I just don't want to have potential dead like rotting cards in counter spells that don't impact the board. Hence, I don't bring in my own disputes to combat that. If I get dispute, I get dispute, and I just play into it usually. I also bring in Damping Sphere just because you can usually time Damping Sphere just before they can cast Corey, or just before they or just after they plot a slick shot. And it's really important to have Damping Sphere minimize the amount of damage output they can do in one turn to try and untap and win the race. In terms of the sideboarding, I trim at least one Krang just because it's really heavy. So with the matchup being much less about resources and much more about playing to the board, the second one is really redundant. You can even consider trimming the first one, but I have other cards I prefer to cut. And trading down against a Mystical Dispute is just not an acceptable trade in my opinion. I trim or cut, the robots just because trading against a Lavadar is just unacceptable in my mind. Perhaps you can keep one and cut the second Krang, but I prefer doing this. And then the Pithing Needle. And that's the prowess matchup. Last but not least, the only matchup I lost in the challenge, the Neoform deck. Game one, you just have to go all in, especially with this build with no Medallion Rebuke's main. You just have to go all in and hope you can outrace them. Game two, the game will look two ways. The first one is a very fast attempt of comboing, hence we have to be stopping them. And the second one is we both interact with each other's like threats, whether that's like our rebukes on their combo or their dispute on our threat, and disenchants on our saga and other threats as well, which kind of prolongs the game in a weird way, especially because like they can also disenchant and consign the kappa. So kappa is not like slam dunk you win the game if you untap sort of threat in that matchup. In those drawn out long games, that's when you want to be using Emery and using like weapons manufacturing to generate advantage to try and steal the win. However, weapons manufacturing is probably the weakest here, just because outside of those slow weak games, you often want to be playing out your 0 drops from turn 1 to hold up rebuke, or even like investing 2 mana to potentially get traded down with 1 mana disenchants, or even like tapping out of your counterspell is very risky. So the way I was sideboarding was this. I think thing like this, and then I was boarding in, yep, D6. Usually I board out the weapons manufacturing or trim them, just because like, again, like I said, the 2 mana investment is quite big, and rarely you want to be playing 2 out, because usually if you already play 1, you probably just want the other manufacturing effect to be either an interaction spell, a payoff, or like leave up mana for interaction. Hence, I always just want to have 1, and with the emissaries, I think these are enough to draw 1. Needle is not great, but you can like potentially try and snipe a fetch land or even stop Grizzlebrand. But if you prefer, you could do something like keep more 0 drops and cut these. And yeah, that's my quick recap and reintroduction to Krang Affinity from my top 8 in Modern Challenge. And the rest of the matchup, for example like the Amulet matchup, the Boros matchup, I will post my sideboard mapping I used for the invitational down below. It does not have like the new cards like the skateboard, the robots, and it's got slightly different like mainboard cards. Like I wasn't playing the spell bombs, I was playing the vexing main and etc. But the core of the deck is still the same. The direction and the overall game plan against each decks should be similar enough that you can probably use that as a starting point and develop from there. And thank you for watching my video until the very end. I really hope everyone can try and win their RCQs early with this affinity deck. I'm probably going to be rocking this in my first RCQs as well. And just overall an exciting transition to the modern season. So I wish you all good luck. Thank you for watching the video and stay tuned for my next videos.